The deputy arrived when the sun had barely cleared the ridge. Its light was thin and unwilling, the kind of November morning that makes a man hunch his shoulders and wish he were somewhere else. Podden Griggs was 28 years old and had held his position with the county for 11 months. He had served papers before: evictions, liens, foreclosures. Each time he told himself it was procedure, not personal. Each time he believed it a little less. He stopped at the threshold of the small wood-frame house and pulled the folded documents from inside his coat. The paper was warm from his body heat. He did not want to hand it over. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that climbed away from the town of Banner Creek, West Virginia. A town of 400 people that had once been 1,200 before the mines closed and the young left and the old stayed behind to watch things fall apart. The house was modest but well built. Somebody who knew wood had put it together. The joints were tight. The porch, though sagging at one corner, had been framed with care. Whoever built this place had loved it before the first nail went in. The door opened before he could knock. Dessa Catlett stood in the doorway. She was 33 years old, though the lines around her eyes and the rawness of her hands made her look older. Her hair was pulled back, her jaw set. Her posture, that of a woman who had been expecting this visit the way a person expects a storm they have watched building on the horizon for weeks. Behind her, visible in the dim interior, 2 children stood close together. The older one, a girl of about 11, held the hand of a boy who could not have been more than 7. The girl's eyes moved from Podden's face to the papers in his hand and back again. She understood. Podden could see it plainly. The boy clutched a small wooden horse against his chest, carved with a skill that suggested patience and love in equal measure. Podden cleared his throat. His breath made a white cloud that hung between them like something neither wanted to claim. "Mrs. Catlett, I'm here on behalf of the county sheriff. The property at this address has been subject to a lien due to outstanding debt. The grace period expired as of midnight last night. I'm required to inform you that you have until sundown today to vacate the premises." He said it the way he had been trained to say it, flat, neutral, legal language stripped of everything human, but his voice cracked on the word vacate, and he hated himself for it. Not because it showed weakness, but because it reminded him that this was not paperwork. This was a woman and 2 children standing in a house that smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something baking, and he was telling them to leave it behind. Dessa did not cry. She looked at Podden with a steadiness that made him want to look away, and he did look away, down at the porch boards, at a knot in the wood that someone had sanded smooth. "Who bought my debt, Mr. Griggs?" The question surprised him. Most people asked how long, or where will we go, or can we have more time? She asked who. As if the machinery behind the eviction mattered more than the eviction itself. As if she already suspected the answer. "I just execute the order, ma'am." He could not meet her eyes when he said it, and he knew she noticed. He set the papers on the porch railing because handing them directly to her felt like too violent an act. Then he walked back to his horse without turning around. He stood with one hand on the saddle for a full minute before mounting. As he rode away, he could see the house getting smaller and the woman still standing in the doorway and the 2 children behind her and the morning light falling across all of it, with the kind of golden indifference that sunlight has always shown to human suffering. Dessa closed the door slowly and pressed her forehead against the wood. It was smooth under her skin, worn by years of hands and weather and use. Larkin had planned this door himself. It took him 2 days because he said the door was the face of a house and you do not cut corners on a face. She remembered his hands working the plane. Large hands, calloused from construction work, but precise. He could feel the grain through his fingertips the way some people hear music. Not just the notes, but the spaces between them. Larkin Catlett had died 2 years ago in a railroad tunnel collapse near Gawley Bridge. He went because the work in Banner Creek had dried up, and the debt from building materials was growing. And a man he knew from the lumber camp said there was good money laying track for the Chesapeake and Ohio if you didn't mind dark places. Larkin did not mind dark places. He minded being away from his family. He wrote letters because a letter is something you can hold. The tunnel caved on a Tuesday afternoon in September. A rider brought the news to Banner Creek 3 days later. Dessa was standing in the kitchen of the house Larkin built when the man knocked and told her that the strongest man she had ever known was buried under a mountain he had been paid to cut through. The debt did not die with him. It grew. Interest compounded. Notices arrived. Dessa took every job she could find, cleaning houses, mending clothes, washing laundry for the boarding house in town. It was not enough. It was never enough. The numbers moved in one direction, and her efforts moved in another, and the distance between them widened like a crack in a wall that no amount of patching can close. Now the wall had broken. She turned from the door and looked at the house. Every surface held a memory. The kitchen table where Larkin carved the wooden horse for Tuck while Nettie practiced her letters by lamplight. The window frame that caught the afternoon sun in summer and turned the whole room amber. The marks on the door frame where she had measured the children's height every 6 months, each pencil line a record of time passing in the most ordinary and sacred way. She could not take the door frame. "Nettie," she said, "start packing, only what we can carry." Dessa Catlett released her brother's hand and moved without hesitation. She was 11 years old and had her father's watchful eyes and her mother's economy of motion. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask why. She went to the bedroom she shared with Tuck and began rolling the quilts her grandmother had woven on a loom that no longer existed in a house that had been sold years before. The quilts were heavy, hand-dyed with walnut hull and indigo, and they smelled like cedar because Nettie kept small chips of it tucked between the folds, a trick her grandmother had taught her for keeping moths away. Tuck stood in the middle of the room holding his wooden horse. He was 7 and understood that something terrible was happening without understanding exactly what it was. He knew the man at the door had brought bad news. He knew his mother's face had gone flat the way it did when she was holding something inside that was too large to let out. He did not know the word eviction. He did not know the word foreclosure. But he knew the feeling of the ground shifting under your feet when you thought it was solid. And he knew it in his stomach before he knew it in his mind. "Tuck," Dessa said gently, "get your things, your horse, your stones, put them in the tin." He moved. The tin was an old coffee can with a lid that did not quite fit. Into it went the horse, 5 smooth stones from the creek bed, a feather he had found in the yard, and a button from a shirt of Larkin's that had lost all its other buttons one by one until this last one fell off, and Tuck claimed it like a survivor. He pressed the lid down and held the can against his ribs. Dessa packed with the deliberateness of someone who knows that every choice matters. The cast iron skillet, 10 inches, seasoned black by years of use. The small pot, its exterior darkened past cleaning. The machete, which Larkin had sharpened the last time he was home, running the blade along the whetstone with slow, even strokes while explaining to Nettie that a sharp tool is safer than a dull one because it goes where you tell it, the hatchet with its hickory handle. Larkin chose hickory because it absorbs shock better than oak or ash, a fact he explained once while splitting kindling that Dessa had stored away the way she stored everything he taught her, in a place where nothing was wasted. Rope, the sewing kit, a hammer and a handful of nails wrapped in cloth to keep them from rattling, the kerosene lamp, dried beans, ground corn, a pouch of seeds she had been saving since the last harvest, tucked inside her coat pocket where the heat of her body would keep them from freezing, and Larkin's folding knife, its handle polished smooth by years of opening and closing, the blade still holding its edge. She looked at the pile on the kitchen table. It was everything, and it was almost nothing. Before she left, she went to the small shelf by the window where a candle stub sat beside a photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph was Larkin and the children at the creek, squinting into the sun, Tuck on Larkin's shoulders, Larkin laughing at something outside the frame. She could not carry the photograph without it getting damaged. She memorized it instead, pressing it into her mind the way you press a flower into a book, knowing it will flatten and dry, but hoping it will keep its color. The folded paper was Larkin's last letter, written from the rail camp in Ohio, mailed 3 days before the tunnel caved. She had read it once, the night it arrived. She had not read it since. She picked it up and placed it against her chest, inside her coat, over her heart. The paper was soft from handling, though she had handled it only that once. Perhaps softness comes not from touch but from weight, from the gravity of words written by a hand that no longer exists. She did not open it. Not yet. That letter was a door she was not ready to walk through again. They left the house at 9:30. Dessa locked the door out of habit, then stood holding the key for a moment before placing it on the porch railing next to the eviction papers. It was a small act, but it contained everything: the surrender of one life and the refusal to beg for its return. They had no vehicle. The mule had been sold 4 months ago to cover groceries through the summer. A man from the next valley paid $6 for it and led it away without looking back. $6. A family's only means of transport exchanged for 2 months of flour and salt. They walked. The dirt road climbed away from the house toward the ridgeline, rutted by wagon tracks and hardened by overnight frost. The November air had a bite to it that found every gap in clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Nettie walked behind her mother carrying the rolled quilts across her shoulders like a yoke. She did not complain. Her eyes swept the landscape as they moved, cataloging the type of trees on the slope: white oak and hickory and tulip poplar. The direction of the wind, northwest, cold, carrying the smell of rain that had not yet fallen. The place where the creek split into 2 channels before rejoining downstream. At one point she stopped, bent down, and picked up a branch. It was straight, hard, about 3 feet long, stripped of bark by weather. She carried it with her. Dessa did not ask why. Both of them understood without words that anything useful was worth carrying. Tuck walked between them, his tin can clutched in both hands, his breath coming in short puffs that he watched disappear with a fascination that was half wonder and half fear. He was tired before they had gone a mile. His legs were short, and the road was steep, and the tin can was heavier than it looked. Or perhaps it was the same weight it had always been, and he was simply less capable of carrying it. 7 years old. The world asks very little of you at 7. And then one day it asks everything. "How much farther, Mama?" "Almost there, baby, almost." She did not know if this was true. She knew the general direction the way you know the location of a place you visited years ago in a different life. For before Larkin died, before the death of everything they had built together, she and Larkin used to explore the hills above Banner Creek on weekends. They would pack biscuits and a jar of cold coffee and ride the mule as far as the trail allowed, then walk into the forest with the children on their backs and the whole afternoon ahead of them. Larkin loved the woods the way he loved wood itself, with a craftsman's attention to structure and grain and possibility. He could look at a hillside and see not just trees but lumber, not just stone but foundation, not just water but power. One afternoon, following the creek upstream, they had found something: a rock formation, elevated, a natural shelf jutting out from the hillside where centuries of water had carved a hollow into the stone. A cave, really, though calling it a cave made it sound darker and smaller than it was. The opening was wide, sheltered by an overhang that kept the interior dry even in rain. Larkin had stood inside it and spread his arms and said, "You could live in here." He was joking. Dessa remembered his laugh echoing off the stone walls. She remembered the way he ran his hand along the rock face with the same touch he used on a piece of finished lumber, reading the surface for flaws and strengths, and the way his eyes moved along the ceiling, already calculating load-bearing capacity, already measuring the space the way a builder measures everything, not because he intends to build, but because measuring is how a builder sees. She was not joking now. After 3 hours of walking, they left the main road and followed the creek upstream, pushing against the current's direction. The water was low and clear, running over a bed of smooth stones that clicked and shifted underfoot. Dessa recognized landmarks: a boulder shaped like a fist, a dead sycamore leaning across the water at a 45-degree angle, a bend where the creek narrowed between 2 rock walls and the sound of the water changed from a murmur to something closer to speech. Nettie saw it first. The shadow under the rock, darker than the surrounding stone, shaped like an open mouth. She pointed without speaking. Dessa nodded. They climbed the last 50 yards in silence, the children behind her, the creek falling away below them, the forest closing in on both sides until the only light came from directly above, filtered through bare branches that scratched the sky like cracks in glass. Dessa pushed aside this brush that had grown across the entrance. Sourwood and rhododendron, thick and tangled but not impassable. She stepped inside. The air was cold but still. No wind. She lit the kerosene lamp and the flame caught and steadied and threw its light across walls that were smooth and pale, shaped by centuries of water and wind into curves that looked almost deliberate, as if the stone had been carved by a sculptor working on a timescale no human could comprehend. The ceiling was high enough to stand. The floor was uneven but mostly flat, covered in a layer of dry leaves and dust. Along the back wall she could see the blackened marks of old fires. Someone had been here before. Shepherds, maybe. Hunters. Travelers passing through on their way to somewhere better. The marks were old. Nobody had used this place in years. Dessa set her load on the ground. The straps had cut into her shoulders, and the release of weight sent a shock of pain through her back that she absorbed without sound. She turned to the children. Nettie stood at the entrance, silhouetted against the fading afternoon light, the quilt still on her shoulders. Tuck pressed against his sister's side, the tin can against his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity that only children can hold in equal measure. "We sleep here tonight," Dessa said. Her voice was steady. "Tomorrow we start working." That first night they huddled under every quilt they had. Dessa built a small fire near the back wall, rationing matches, each one struck with care because she did not know how many remained in the box and would not count them until morning when the light was better and the act of counting would feel less like measuring the distance to disaster. The smoke rose and found a natural crack in the ceiling, a fissure where the rock had split along some ancient fault line, and the smoke threaded through it and disappeared. Dessa watched it go. In the firelight, the cave walls shifted between shadow and gold, and the children's faces were soft with exhaustion, and the world outside was dark and cold and indifferent. And in here there was warmth and the sound of breathing and the smell of wood smoke, and for now, for this one night, that was enough. When Nettie and Tuck were asleep, their bodies curved together under the quilts like two animals sharing heat, Dessa sat alone by the fire. She did not think about Larkin. She did not think about the house. She didn't allow herself to feel anything at all because she understood, with the instinct of someone who has learned survival not from books but from necessity, that emotion was a luxury she could not yet afford. Instead, she calculated. 14 matches left, enough ground corn for 5 days if she rationed carefully, beans for perhaps a week. The creek was 40 yards downhill, which meant water was not a problem in terms of distance, but carrying it uphill in a single dented pot would be slow work. The wood around the cave was mostly hardwood, oak and hickory, some of it fallen and dry, which meant fuel was available if she could cut it. She had the hatchet and the machete. She had rope. She had her hands. She looked at those hands in the firelight. The knuckles were swollen. The skin across her palms was rough and cracked. These were the hands that had held Larkin's face on their wedding day, the hands that had signed the loan papers for the building materials, the hands that had gripped the doorframe the night the rider brought the news. They were the same hands. They would have to be enough. She reached inside her coat and touched the letter. Larkin's handwriting on the outside, her name, Dessa, in the careful script he used when he wanted to get something right. She held it there for a moment, feeling the paper against her heartbeat. Then she put it back. Not yet. She was not ready for whatever those words would do to her. She needed to stay sharp. She needed to think in numbers and distances and resources, not in love and loss and longing. Tomorrow they would begin. The next morning broke cold and gray. Dessa was already up, feeding the fire with small sticks, conserving the larger wood. Nettie woke next, then Tuck, and they ate a small portion of corn mush cooked in the pot and drank water from the creek that Dessa had boiled. Breakfast took 12 minutes. It would be the most organized 12 minutes of the day. After that, everything was labor. They swept the cave floor with bundles of juniper branches, the needles releasing a sharp, clean scent that pushed back the smell of damp earth. They cleared loose stones, piling them outside. They leveled the ground where the sleeping area would be, scraping with flat rocks until the surface was even enough that a body could lie down without rolling. Dessa marked the spot for the hearth with a circle of stones, positioning it against the north wall where the natural crack in the ceiling would draw the smoke upward. Nettie explored the creek and came back with a report. There are fish under the flat rock near the bend, small ones, silver. They move too fast to catch with hands. We need still water, Dessa said. A pool where they slow down, maybe a small dam, but the wall comes first. There were no boards. No nails beyond the handful she had brought. No money to buy materials. They would use what the mountain offered. And the mountain, for all its harshness, offered plenty to those who knew how to look. Fallen trees lay scattered across the hillside, some recently toppled by wind, others dead for years, their wood dried hard by time and weather. Dessa selected trunks that were straight and sound, testing them the way Larkin had taught her, kicking the bark to check for rot, lifting one end to judge the weight, pressing her thumbnail into the grain to feel whether the wood was solid or soft. Good wood resists the nail. That was one of Larkin's rules. She heard his voice every time she swung the hatchet, and she swung it the way he had showed her. Close to the base, the blade angled to make a clean cut that would not waste effort or edge. She cut. Nettie and Tuck dragged. They set posts on either side of the cave entrance and began building a wall piece by piece, log by log, filling gaps with smaller branches and wedging them tight. Dessa's hands blistered on the first day, the fluid under the skin catching light like small trapped windows. By the third day, the blisters had broken and the skin beneath was raw and new and painful in a way that made gripping the hatchet an act of will. By the end of the week, calluses began forming, hard yellow pads that were ugly and functional and that she regarded with a satisfaction she told no one about. Tuck packed moss and dry grass into the gaps between logs, pressing it tight with small fingers. "It's good, Mama," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "Real good." His pride was enormous and unearned and entirely appropriate for a 7-year-old who has just contributed something tangible to his family's survival. When the wall reached chest height on Dessa, she needed a door. A door required hinges, and hinges required a trip to town. She walked down to Banner Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a bundle of mending she had agreed to do for the woman who ran the hardware store. 3 pairs of work pants with torn knees, a winter coat with a ripped lining. The exchange rate was simple: labor for materials, 2 steel hinges used but functional, and 4 screws. It was at the hardware store that she met Harlan Deaver. He was 67 years old, with a face like weathered oak, deeply lined, hard-surfaced, but with a grain that suggested it had once been smooth. He was a farmer, a man who had fought for the Union during the war, and who had lived his entire life within 20 miles of the spot where he was born, and who regarded the world beyond those 20 miles with a suspicion that was not entirely unfounded. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and boots that had been resoled more than once. His hands were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, and he held a bag of feed on one shoulder with the ease of someone who has been carrying heavy things since before carrying heavy things became remarkable. He watched Dessa pay for the hinges with mending work, and he watched her tuck them into her coat, and he said, without introduction or preamble, "You're the Catlett woman." "I am. Heard you're living up in that rock shelf above the South Fork." She didn't ask how he had heard. In a town of 400 people, information traveled at the speed of boredom. "I am." Harlan Deaver set the feed bag down and looked at her the way a man looks at a building he suspects is not up to code. Not with contempt, with genuine structural concern. "You're putting those kids in a death trap. Winter up there kills people. I've seen experienced hunters freeze to death not 4 years back, a quarter mile from where you're sleeping. A grown man with gear and a rifle dead by morning. You should go to the shelter in town." Dessa met his eyes. "A shelter isn't a home, Mr. Deaver." "A cave isn't a home either. It's a grave waiting to happen." He picked up his feed bag and walked out without saying goodbye. Dessa stood in the hardware store with 2 used hinges in her coat, and the words "a grave waiting to happen" sitting in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She built the door that afternoon. Salvaged planks cut to size, joined with crosspieces and hung on the new hinges. It closed square. It blocked the wind. When she pushed it shut that evening and heard it catch against the frame, solid and definite, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope. Hope was too generous a word for what she felt. It was closer to defiance. A door is a statement. It says, "This space is mine." That night, after the fire was lit and the door was closed and the cave was warm enough that the children's breath no longer showed in the air, Nettie spoke from under the quilts. "Mama, Mr. Deaver said winter kills people up here. He knows more about the mountain than we do." Dessa looked at the fire for a long time. The flames bent and straightened, like something trying to make up its mind. "He knows more about the mountain, but he doesn't know that we have nowhere else to go." Nettie was quiet. Then Dessa heard a small scraping sound. She looked over and saw her daughter sitting up, holding the straight branch she had picked up on the road. Nettie pressed the sharp end against the cave wall and scratched a single vertical line into the stone. Day 1. Dessa watched her daughter mark the wall and felt for the first time the full weight of the decision she had made. Not just for herself, but for 2 lives that depended entirely on her. 2 children who trusted her not because she had earned that trust with guarantees, but because she was their mother, and mothers are supposed to know the way even when there is no way, even when the path is a dry creek bed leading to a hole in a rock on a mountain where the winter kills. In the darkness before sleep came, Dessa's mind turned to Podden Griggs, the way he could not look at her when she asked who bought the debt. She thought about a fine black horse she had seen tied outside the courthouse in town 3 months ago. She had not paid attention then. Everyone knew the horse. Everyone knew the man who rode it, Calder Stokes. He owned the largest spread in the valley, 300 acres of bottomland that he had assembled over 20 years by buying foreclosed homesteads at auction, one piece at a time, turning other people's misfortune into his own expansion. She had heard his name attached to other evictions, other families pushed out, other houses emptied and boarded up. She had felt sorry for those families the way you feel sorry for strangers, with sincerity but without urgency. Now she was one of them. And the question she had asked Peyton was not born from curiosity but from a suspicion that was hardening in the quiet of this cave, in the dark, with the fire burning low and her children breathing beside her. Her house had not been taken by bad luck or bad timing. It had been taken by a man who saw opportunity in her grief and moved on it with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times before. She did not have proof, not yet, but she had the question. And a question once asked does not go away. It sits in the mind like a coal that will not cool, waiting for enough air to catch fire. That reckoning would come later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was keeping the fire alive through the night. She fed it one more stick of dry oak, watched the flame catch, and lay down beside her children. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees with a sound like breathing. Inside, the fire crackled and the stone walls held the warmth close, and the door, Larkin's kind of door, square and true, stood between them and everything else. 7 days passed, each one a little harder than the last and each one a little more certain. Dessa extended the wall until it sealed the cave entrance completely, leaving only the door as passage. She chinked every gap with mud and moss, pressing the mixture deep with her fingers until the wind, which had been finding its way through a dozen invisible channels, was finally silenced. The cave grew warmer. Not comfortable. Not anything a person with a house would call warm, but warmer than the night air outside, warmer than a lean-to or a tent, or the open hillside where Harlan Deaver said a hunter had died. Warmer was enough. The hearth took shape. She built a ring of creek stones around the fire pit and laid a flat slab of sandstone across 2 upright rocks to serve as a cooking surface. The first time she set the skillet on it and heard the iron ring against the stone, a sound so familiar it could have come from her own kitchen, she had to press her lips together and wait for the feeling to pass. Nettie organized the interior of the cave with a precision that surprised Dessa and then stopped surprising her. The girl divided the space into zones. Sleeping area along the south wall, farthest from the entrance, where the residual heat from the fire gathered against the stone. Storage along the east wall, tools hung from wooden pegs driven into cracks in the rock, the rope coiled and hung, the machete and hatchet side by side. Food kept near the back, where the temperature was coolest and most constant. Firewood stacked along the west wall, closest to the hearth, arranged by size, the way Larkin used to arrange lumber in his workshop, smallest on top, largest on the bottom, so that nothing had to be moved to get what you needed. Tuck took charge of the firewood without being asked. He learned to sort by quality, placing the dense, heavy pieces of oak and hickory in one pile and the softer, lighter pieces of poplar and pine in another. He arranged them by size along the cave wall, smallest to largest, with the precision of someone organizing tools rather than fuel. Dessa watched him work and said nothing. The boy was building a system, and systems are what keep people alive when will alone runs out. On the 12th day, a voice came through the fog. Ardith Sperling arrived on a morning when the mist was so thick that Dessa heard her before she saw her. Footsteps on the trail, slow and deliberate, the sound of someone who knows that rushing on a mountain path is how ankles break. Then a shape materializing out of the white air. A woman in a dark wool shawl, carrying a clay jar in one hand and a folded blanket under the other arm. Ardith was 72 years old. Her face was mapped with lines that ran deep, not from age alone, but from weather and grief, and the particular kind of endurance that comes from outlasting things that should have killed you. She set the jar and the blanket on the ground outside the cave and looked at Dessa with eyes that held no pity, which was the first reason Dessa decided to trust her. "Lard," Ardith said, nodding at the jar, "and a wool blanket, mill-made from over in Lewisburg, still good." "I can't pay for these. It's not charity, it is custom. Out here we help and we get helped. That's how it works." Dessa accepted without further protest. She understood the contract. Ardith had not come to rescue her. She had come to establish a relationship that would, at some future point Dessa could not yet see, require reciprocity. Ardith stayed longer than Dessa expected. She sat on a flat rock near the entrance and looked at the wall, the door, the hearth. Her eyes moved the way a building inspector's eyes move, cataloging structural details without comment. Then she spoke, and what she said was not about construction. 30 years ago, my husband signed papers he never read, refinanced our farm on terms that were designed to fail. By the time I understood what he'd done, the bank already had the deed. I was 37, 2 boys, no money, no land." She paused. The fog was thinning and pale sunlight was beginning to filter through. "I didn't have a cave. I had the church and other people's pity. It took me 10 years to stop feeling grateful for things I should have been angry about." She looked at Dessa directly. "You're different. You're angry. Keep that. It's more useful than gratitude." Dessa did not understand the words at the time, not fully. She filed them away the way she filed Larkin's lessons, in a place where things waited until she was ready to use them. Ardith stood, adjusted her shawl, and walked back into the thinning fog without saying goodbye. Dessa watched her disappear and stood for a long time in the quiet that followed, holding the jar of lard in one hand and the weight of Ardith's words in the other. That night, Nettie scratched the 12th mark into the cave wall. 12 days, 12 lines scored into stone, a record that no one had asked her to keep and that she kept anyway because she understood, at 11 years old, that counting the days was not about tracking time. It was about proving that they were still here, that each mark was not just a day passed, but a day survived, a day earned. Dessa sat by the fire after the children slept and thought about Ardith's story, and about the fine black horse outside the courthouse, and about the question she had asked Padden Griggs that he would not answer. Who bought my debt? The words circled in her mind like water circling a drain, pulling everything else toward their center. She thought about the 7 other families she had heard about, other homes emptied, other names on other documents. She thought about 300 acres of bottomland assembled one foreclosure at a time. She thought about Calder Stokes sitting in a warm house somewhere in the valley, a man who had never swung a hatchet in the cold or carried stones uphill or slept in a cave with 2 children and 14 matches and no certainty beyond the next sunrise. A man who purchased other people's grief at a discount and converted it into acreage. The anger Ardith told her to keep stirred in her chest. Not the hot kind. Not the kind that burns itself out in shouting and leaves nothing behind but ash and shame. The cold kind. The kind that settles into your bones and stays there and fuels you through the long nights when everything else runs out. Dessa did not yet know what to do with that anger. She did not yet have the proof or the opportunity or the clarity that action requires. But she had the fuel. And fuel, properly stored, properly conserved, properly tended, can burn for a very long time. She fed the fire one last stick of oak and watched it catch. The flame was small but steady. Like everything else she was building in this place, small, steady, refusing to go out. Outside the cave, the November wind moved through the bare trees. The creek murmured below in the darkness. Somewhere in the valley, in a house built with lumber and nails and money, a man named Calder Stokes slept in a warm bed, certain that the woman he had displaced was already gone, already erased, already a line item in his ledger, closed and accounted for. He was wrong. On the ledge outside the cave, Nettie's tally marks caught the last light of the dying fire, 12 small scars in the stone, each one a quiet refusal. Inside, the door held, the walls held, the fire held, and Dessa Catlett, 33 years old, with cracked hands and a dead husband's letter pressed against her heart, and 2 children breathing softly in the dark beside her, held too. She held because there was nothing else to do, because the alternative was the church shelter and other people's pity and the slow erasure of everything she and Larkin had built. Because a man had looked at her grief and her debt and her dead husband and had seen not a woman but an opportunity. Because Ardith Sperling had told her to keep the anger, and she intended to. The fire burned, the wind blew, the mountain waited, vast and cold and patient, the way mountains have always waited for the people who insist on climbing them. Dessa closed her eyes. Tomorrow there would be a chimney to build, a dam to plan, fish to catch, children to feed, a life to construct from nothing but stone and wood and water, and the stubborn conviction that she deserved to exist in a place that was hers. Tomorrow there would be work. Tonight there was the fire and the door and the 2 small bodies warm against her side, and the letter she was not yet ready to read, and the anger she was not yet ready to use, both of them waiting, both of them patient, both of them certain, in the way that fire and anger are always certain, that their time would come. The smoke nearly killed Nettie on a Wednesday. Dessa had spent 3 days building the chimney. She selected stones from the creek bed one at a time, carrying them up the slope in her arms because she had no bucket and no wheelbarrow and no one to help her except 2 children whose combined weight was less than the load she carried on each trip. She built the column against the north wall where the natural fissure in the ceiling already drew air upward, stacking the stones in a tapering column, mortaring them with a paste of creek mud mixed with sand and dried moss. She had watched the old masons in Banner Creek work this way when she was a girl, standing at the edge of construction sites with the patience of someone who did not yet know she was learning something that would one day save her life. The first attempt failed. She lit the fire at the base of the new chimney and waited. For 30 seconds, the smoke climbed obediently, threading into the gaps between stones, rising toward the fissure. Then, something shifted. The draft reversed. Smoke poured back into the cave in a thick gray wave that filled the space from ceiling to floor in less than a minute. Dessa grabbed Tuck and pushed him toward the entrance. She turned for Nettie and found her daughter on her knees, coughing so hard that no sound came out, her mouth open, her eyes streaming, her hands clawing at her own throat in the involuntary panic of a body that cannot breathe. Dessa dragged Nettie outside and held her in the cold air, the girl's back against her chest, Dessa's arms wrapped around her from behind, pressing rhythmically against her diaphragm until the coughing broke, and Nettie pulled in a long, ragged breath that sounded like fabric tearing. They sat on the ledge outside the cave for 20 minutes while Nettie's breathing steadied. Tuck sat beside them, creeing quietly, not from pain, but from the terror of watching his sister's face turn the color of ash. Harlan Deaver's voice arrived uninvited in Dessa's mind. A grave waiting to happen. She looked at Nettie's red, swollen eyes and at Tuck's tear-streaked face, and she asked herself the question she had been refusing to ask since the day they arrived. Am I wrong? Am I doing this to prove something to myself while my children pay the price? The question sat in her chest for a full minute. She could feel its weight pressing against the inside of her ribs, heavier than any stone she had carried up the hill, heavier than the quilts on her back the day they walked away from the house. It was the kind of question that, once asked, changes the shape of everything around it, because the answer, whatever it was, would determine whether she kept building or started walking back down the mountain toward the shelter in town and the church meals and the slow, quiet surrender of everything she believed she was. Then she stood up. She set Nettie gently against the rock wall. She wiped her daughter's face with the hem of her shirt. She looked at Tuck and said, "Stay with your sister." And she went back inside. She studied the chimney. The column was too wide at the top. The opening needed to narrow so the rising heat would accelerate the draft and pull the smoke upward rather than letting it spill back when the outside air pushed down. She also needed to angle the internal channel so the wind could not blow directly down the shaft. She dismantled the top third of the column, stone by stone, pulling apart what she had spent a full day building, setting each piece aside with the care of someone who knows she will need them again in a different arrangement. She reshaped the opening, redirected the flue with a series of offset stones that created a zigzag path for the smoke. The zigzag would slow the downward push of cold air while allowing the warm smoke to rise through the bends by its own buoyancy. It took 4 hours. Her hands bled where the rough stone edges cut through the calluses she had only just built. The blood mixed with creek mud and dried in dark streaks across her fingers, and she did not stop to clean them, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant the question would come back, and she was not ready to sit with it again. She lit the fire. The smoke rose, entered the chimney, climbed the column, threaded through the zigzag bends, and vanished through the fissure without a trace. Warm air spread through the cave, reaching the corners, softening the cold that had lived in the stone since long before they arrived. The heat touched the walls, and the walls held it the way stone holds everything, slowly and for a long time. "It works," Tuck whispered. He was standing in the entrance, afraid to come all the way in, watching the fire with the wariness of someone who has just learned that the same element can sustain you and destroy you. "It works because we tried again," Dessa said. "She didn't say it works because I'm smart or because I figured it out. She said we tried again." Nettie heard the word "we" and understood what her mother was doing. She was distributing the weight, making the failure shared so that the success could be shared too. Nettie added a second tally mark to the cave wall that night. She did not record the failure. Some things are better counted by what comes after them. With heat solved, water became the central task. The creek ran fast and shallow over a bed of loose stone, impossible to scoop with any efficiency. Dessa walked the full length of the creek that passed through their section of the valley, studying every bend, every boulder, every place where the current slowed or the channel widened. She found what she needed 100 yards downstream from the cave, a spot where the creek bed opened into a natural basin and the water lost its urgency, spreading thin and slow over a wide flat of gravel. Building the dam took the better part of a week. They arranged large stones in a low arc across the creek, leaving a central gap where excess water could pass without building enough pressure to break the structure. Dessa lifted the heavy ones, choosing each for its shape and weight the way Larkin used to choose boards for a frame, rejecting anything that did not sit flat or interlock with its neighbor. The stones had to work together. A dam is not a pile. It is a collaboration between objects that do not know they are collaborating. Tuck filled the spaces between the big stones with smaller ones, working with a focus that made him forget to complain about the cold water numbing his fingers. His hands were red and clumsy, and he dropped more stones than he placed, but he did not stop. Each stone that held was a victory. Each gap that sealed was a problem solved, and the solving of problems, Dessa was beginning to understand, was the thing that kept her son from being consumed by the fear that lived behind his eyes. and came out at night in restless sleep and small sounds that were not quite words and not quite cries. Nettie packed moss into the remaining gaps, pressing it deep with a stick, testing each section by pouring water over it and watching where it leaked. She approached the work the way she approached everything, with a methodical patience that made her seem older than 11, and that reminded Dessa so much of Larkin that she sometimes had to look away. The water rose slowly behind the dam, inch by inch, until a pool formed that was clear and deep enough to see the creek bed through it. Still water, patient water, water that no longer rushed past but sat and waited. On the third day, fish appeared in the pool, moving slowly in the still water, no longer able to outrun a patient hand. Fishing became ritual. Nettie learned to wait, to lower her hand into the water slowly enough that the fish did not register it as threat, to hold her fingers open just beneath the surface, motionless, until a trout drifted between them with the casual confidence of a creature that has never been caught, to close her fingers at the exact moment when hesitation becomes failure. She missed the first 7 attempts. On the 8th, she lifted a brook trout from the pool with both hands, its body flashing silver in the afternoon light, its tail slapping against her wrist. She held it up and looked at Dessa with an expression that was not triumph, but something quieter and more durable. Competence. Dessa taught her to clean the catch with Larkin's folding knife, to split the belly in one stroke, to remove the guts without puncturing them, to lay the fillets over a rack of green sticks above a bed of low coals so the smoke could do its work without cooking the flesh. When they had no salt, they dried the fish in strips on flat rocks in whatever sun the November sky allowed. The first meal of smoked fish they ate together by the fire was the first meal since the eviction that tasted like something other than necessity. Tuck ate with his hands, pulling the flaky meat apart and putting it in his mouth with a speed that suggested not just hunger, but pleasure. Nettie ate slowly, examining the texture, the color, the way the smoke had changed the flesh from pale, translucent pink to something golden and firm. She was not just eating, she was studying. "How long will it keep?" Nettie asked. 2 weeks if we dry it right, longer if the cold holds." Nettie nodded and Dessa could see the calculation happening behind her daughter's eyes. Fish per day, days per week, weeks until spring. The arithmetic of survival, performed by an 11-year-old girl who should have been doing sums in a schoolroom, but was instead computing the caloric requirements of a family living in a cave. The smoked fish changed everything. For the first time since they arrived, Dessa was not counting meals. She was storing them. She built a second drying rack, then a third. She began rotating the fish, moving the oldest strips to the front for eating and the freshest to the back for continued curing. The shift from consumption to preservation, from eating to planning, was small in practical terms, but enormous in what it meant. You do not preserve food if you intend to leave. You preserve food if you intend to stay. Tuck organized the dried fish alongside his firewood system, everything in rows, everything labeled in his mind with a system only he fully understood, but that functioned with a reliability that made Dessa trust it completely. Nettie began keeping records on the cave wall, not just tally marks for days, but numbers. Fish caught, firewood stacked, meals eaten, a ledger scratched into stone, evidence that they were not surviving but functioning, not hiding, but building, not failing, but keeping accounts that any reasonable person would have to respect. Pastor Lemuel Fawcett arrived on a cool morning 3 weeks after they had moved into the cave. Dessa saw him coming up the trail and felt her body tighten. She did not know what she was expecting, but she was expecting something. Nobody climbed this trail without a reason, and the reason so far had been either kindness or warning, and she was not sure which was harder to receive. Pastor Lemuel was 52, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a broad open face that projected warmth in the way a furnace projects heat, steadily from a source you cannot see. He wore a clean canvas jacket and carried a Bible in one hand. Not ostentatiously, but not hidden either. Positioned at his side the way a man carries a tool he uses often enough that holding it has become unconscious. He smiled when he saw the cave. It was a careful smile, the kind that precedes difficult conversation. "Dessa, I've heard about what you're doing up here. I wanted to come and see for myself." He walked the perimeter, looked at the chimney, the dam, the fish drying on the rack, watched Nettie splitting kindling with the hatchet, her strokes short and controlled, watched Tuck stacking firewood with his meticulous system. "You've done remarkable work," he said. "Truly. But I want to talk to you about the children." Dessa's body changed before her mind caught up. Her shoulders squared. Her hands, which had been resting at her sides, closed into loose fists. She had been expecting this, not from Pastor Lemuel specifically, but from someone. She had been waiting for the world to send its representative, the person who would stand in front of her and say what she feared most. "2 children living in a cave," Pastor Lemuel said. His voice was gentle, but his words were not. "No school, no running water, no medical care, no heat except an open fire. Dessa, I have a responsibility to this community. The church shelter has beds, hot water, a kitchen. The children would be safe there." "They're safe here." "Are they?" He let the question hang. Then he added quietly, the way a man adds the final weight to a scale he has already decided to tip. "If the county judge were to hear about the living conditions up here, he could declare those children wards of the state and place them in a poorhouse. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what I see." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything Dessa had held inside since the day Pot and Grigg stood on her porch. The grief she had not allowed herself, the doubt Harlan Deaver had planted, the fear that woke her at 3 in the morning when the fire was low and the cold crept in, and she lay rigid beside her sleeping children listening for sounds that meant danger. All of it rose now, and for the first time since the eviction, Dessa Catlett raised her voice. "Mr. Fawcett, my children have a roof over their heads. They have a fire that burns all night. They eat every single day. Nettie can identify every tree on this mountain by its bark. She can catch and clean a fish and smoke it so it lasts 2 weeks. Tuck can keep a fire burning through a 12-hour night without letting it die and without wasting wood. Do you know how many children in your shelter can do any of that?" She took a breath. Her chest was heaving, but her voice did not waver. "You come up here and you talk about responsibility. My responsibility is keeping my children alive, not keeping you comfortable." Her voice echoed off the stone walls and came back to her changed, harder, with an edge she had not known was there. Pastor Lemuel did not flinch, but his careful smile was gone. He nodded once, slowly, and turned to leave. At the edge of the trail, he paused without looking back. "I hope you're right, Dessa, I truly do." He walked down the mountain. Dessa watched him go and felt the adrenaline drain out of her legs and replace itself with a trembling she could not stop. She sat down on the ledge and pressed her palms against the cold stone and breathed until the shaking passed. That night, after Tuck fell asleep, Dessa found Nettie sitting outside the cave entrance, knees drawn up, looking at a sky packed with stars. Dessa sat beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The creek murmured below. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness. 2 notes repeated, patient. "Mama," Nettie said. Her voice was thin and careful, the voice of a child trying very hard to sound brave. "If they come to take us, can you stop them?" Dessa wanted to say yes. The word was right there, ready, simple, 1 syllable of absolute assurance. But she had made a decision on the day they left the house that she would not lie to her children, not even the kind lies that parents use to build walls between their kids and the world's sharp edges. "I won't let anyone take you without going through me first." It was not a guarantee, it was a position. Nettie heard the difference and accepted it with a nod that was older than 11 years. She went inside and added another mark to the wall and lay down beside her brother and closed her eyes. That night, lying awake, Dessa replayed the pastor's words, wards of the state, poorhouse. The words were blunt instruments and they had done their work. She could feel the bruises they left deep inside in the place where her confidence lived. The place that she had been building up stone by stone the same way she built the chimney and the dam. She didn't sleep until the fire needed feeding, and then she fed it and lay back down and stared at the ceiling and listened to her children breathe and told herself that she was right. She told herself again and again, and the telling became a kind of prayer, repeated not because she believed it, but because the repetition itself was a wall against the doubt and walls were what she knew how to build. The blizzard came on a night without stars or moon. The sky sealed shut like a lid pressed down over the valley. The wind hit the cave entrance with a force that bowed the door inward and sent fine snow through every gap in the wall. Dessa fed the fire and listened to the storm's escalation, the pitch rising from moan to howl to something beyond howl, a frequency that vibrated in her teeth and made the children press closer together under the quilts. Then the smoke stopped rising. It happened in an instant. One moment the chimney was drawing cleanly. The next, the smoke had nowhere to go and began filling the cave, pooling against the ceiling and descending like a gray tide. Dessa knew immediately. Ice had sealed the fissure above the chimney. The blizzard had packed snow and frozen moisture into the gap until no air could pass. She told Nettie to stay with Tuck. She pulled on her coat and pushed through the door into a world that had become unrecognizable. The wind hit her with a physical force that staggered her sideways. Snow drove horizontally, so thick she could not see her own hands. She climbed the rock face from memory, her fingers finding holds she had mapped during the weeks of carrying chimney stones, her boots scraping against ice-covered ledges that had been dry stone that morning. The cold was not an absence of warmth. It was a presence, a thing with weight and intention that pressed against her body from every direction and tried to pull the heat out of her core the way a river pulls sediment from a bank. Near the top, her left foot slipped. She fell perhaps 3 feet. Her right shoulder struck a jutting edge of rock. Pain detonated through her arm and into her neck, and for a moment she hung by her right hand alone, her left arm numb, her body swinging in the wind like something hung out to dry. She found a foothold. She pulled herself up. Her left hand would not close properly. The fingers responded but weakly, as if the signals from her brain were arriving late and diminished. She reached the chimney opening. It was sealed with a cap of compacted ice and snow, smooth and hard, glowing faintly in the darkness. She wedged herself against the rock and swung the hatchet with her right hand. Awkward, off balance, each stroke jarring through her injured shoulder. The ice cracked in pieces. She struck again, again, again. The rhythm was ragged, nothing like the clean efficiency Larkin had taught her. But efficiency was a luxury for calm days, and this was not a calm day. The only thing that mattered was breaking through before the smoke below became lethal. The ice gave way. Smoke erupted from the opening, a dark plume that the wind seized and shredded. Dessa dropped the hatchet and fell to her knees on the ledge, her right hand braced against the stone, her left arm hanging, her entire body shaking with a violence she could not control. And then she cried. Not from the pain in her shoulder, though it was considerable. Not from the cold or the wind or the exhaustion. She cried because of Larkin, because of the house, because of the debt and Harlan Deaver being right and Pastor Lemuel being possibly right, and Calder Stokes sitting in a warm house somewhere in the valley having purchased her life at a discount she could not yet name but could feel in her bones. She cried because she was alone on a rock ledge in a blizzard at 2 a.m. with a numb left arm and 2 children below her who would die if she failed. And nobody in the world knew where they were and nobody would come looking. She cried for 2 minutes. Then she stopped. She picked up the hatchet with her good hand. She climbed down. The descent was harder than the ascent because her left arm could not grip and her right shoulder screamed with every movement, and the ice on the rock face had thickened in the minutes she had been on the ledge. She went slowly, one hold at a time, one breath at a time, the way you descend anything dangerous, not by being brave, but by being careful enough that bravery is not required. Inside the cave, Nettie had wrapped Tuck in every available quilt and positioned him near the fire, which was burning clean again, the smoke rising obediently through the repaired chimney. When Dessa came through the door, coated in snow and ice, her left hand swollen, her eyes raw, Nettie did not speak. She took the hatchet from her mother's good hand. She guided Dessa to the fire. She wrapped the injured hand in a strip torn from the hem of her own shirt. Tuck pressed his body against his mother's back, giving her whatever heat a 45-pound boy can generate, which is not much in absolute terms, but is everything in the terms that matter. The pain returned with the warmth, sharp and insistent. and Dessa let it come because pain meant the hand was not dead. She sat by the fire and let her children care for her, and felt something she had never allowed herself to feel in their presence. Helplessness. For 10 minutes she was not the mother, not the provider, not the architect of their survival. She was a woman with an injured hand and a broken sense of her own invincibility. And her children were holding her together with a blanket and a body and a silence that said, "We are here and that is enough." After Nettie and Tuck fell asleep, Dessa reached inside her coat and took out Larkin's letter. The paper was damp from snow, but the ink had held. She unfolded it by the fire. Her hands trembled, and not from the cold. Larkin's handwriting was steady and unhurried. The letters formed with the same care he brought to everything he built. He wrote about the job site, the cold mornings, the men he worked with. He wrote about missing the sound of the creek and Tuck's questions and Nettie's quiet way of watching everything. He wrote that he would be home after this project, that the money would be enough to pay down the loan, that he wanted to add a room to the house for the baby they had been talking about. The one they had not yet named, but who already existed in their plans as a certainty. A future person waiting to be born into a family that had a house and a creek and a father who could build anything. The last line read, "You are the strongest person I know, but you do not have to be strong alone." Dessa folded the letter and held it against her chest and understood finally what Ardith Sperling had meant. The anger Ardith told her to keep was not rage or bitterness. It was the refusal to accept the terms the world had offered her. The terms that said she should be grateful for a shelter cot and a church meal, and the slow erasure of everything she and Larkin had built. The anger was a rejection of that script. It was the insistence that she deserved more. Not because she was special, but because she had earned it with her hands, with her back, with every stone she carried up the hillside, and every fish she smoked over coals, and every night she kept the fire burning while her children slept. She put the letter back inside her coat. She would not need to read it again. The words had done what they needed to do. They had given her permission to be both strong and broken, to carry the weight and to admit that it was heavy, to be Larkin's wife in her own person and a mother who did not have all the answers, but who would not stop working until she found enough of them to keep going. Morning came white and silent. The blizzard had passed. Snow covered everything, transforming the mountain into a landscape so clean it looked new, as if the world had been erased and redrawn overnight. The dam stood, the wall held, the chimney worked. At noon, footsteps in the snow. Harlan Deaver appeared at the edge of the clearing, a canvas bag on his back, his boots breaking through the crust with each step. He didn't announce himself. He set the bag down outside the cave and opened it. Wood pane tablets, gauze, a tin of rendered beef tallow for waterproofing, salted pork wrapped in cloth, and a coil of steel wire. "Wire holds a door frame better than rope in the cold," he said. He looked at Dessa's wrapped hand but did not ask what happened. He looked at the chimney, the dam, the rack of smoked fish. He was quiet for a long time. "You're stubborn as hell," he said. Then, after a pause that held its own weight, "But this place is more solid than I figured." He didn't apologize for what he had said at the hardware store. He was not that kind of man. But his presence was its own apology, and Dessa received it as such. He didn't stay long that first time, but he came back 3 days later, and 3 days after that, and gradually the visit shifted from inspection to conversation. He told her about the war, not the fighting, but the aftermath. The nights spent in muddy trenches listening to rain. The mornings when you woke up and checked your body and found that everything was still attached and felt not relief, but a flat, hollow surprise, like a clock still ticking after being dropped. "You don't survive because you're brave," Harlan said one afternoon, sitting on the ledge outside the cave, watching smoke rise from the chimney into a sky the color of tin. "You survive because the alternative isn't available." Dessa understood that sentence in a place deeper than language. She had been living inside it for months. He began bringing things, not gifts, supplies. The distinction mattered to both of them. A gift implies generosity, which implies inequality, which implies obligation. Supplies are what one working person provides to another working person when the work requires it. He brought a whetstone for the hatchet, a ball of twine, a piece of canvas that could serve as a ground cover or a rain shade or a dozen other things depending on what the day demanded. Each time he came, he stayed a little longer. He helped Dessa reinforce the dam with heavier stones she could not lift alone. He showed Tuck how to split kindling with a single downward stroke, the hatchet held close to the head for control rather than swung from the shoulder for power. He watched Nettie's tally marks multiply on the cave wall and said nothing about them, but Dessa noticed that he counted them each time he came, his eyes moving along the rows with the quiet attention of a man reading a report. February loosened winter's grip by degrees. The sun warmed the rock face at midday. Ice retreated from the creek edges. The first green shoot appeared beside the dam, a single stem bent by wind but alive, pushing up through ground that had been frozen solid 2 weeks before. Dessa smiled when she saw it, and the smile surprised her because it came from somewhere she had not visited in a long time. She cleared a patch of ground near the cave with the machete, pulling stones and roots, breaking the soil with the hatchet blade turned sideways. Nettie and Tuck worked beside her, learning to distinguish dark, rich earth from pale, exhausted ground by touch and smell. They planted corn and beans using the seeds Dessa had carried inside her coat pocket since before the eviction, through the entire winter, carried next to Larkin's letter, 2 kinds of future pressed against her body. They mixed the soil with ash from the hearth, buried the seeds at a depth of 2 knuckles, covered them carefully, watered from the dam using punctured tin cans, slow, deliberate, each trip up the slope an investment in something they would not see for months. Every day they checked the soil moisture by pressing their fingers into the earth and reading what it told them. Wet meant wait, dry meant carry water. The language was simple and the work was not. Tuck asked every morning if the seeds had come up yet. Every morning Dessa said not yet. And every morning Tuck accepted the answer and went to check anyway, kneeling beside the planting rows with his face close to the dirt, looking for something that was not there yet but that he believed in with the faith of a 7-year-old, which is the strongest faith there is because it has not yet learned the reasons it should fail. On a Thursday afternoon in late February, a green thread broke through the soil in the first row. Dessa knelt beside it and touched the tiny leaf with one finger and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Dessa went to town the following week to trade smoked fish for salt. At the general store, Orvilla Tate, the owner, leaned across the counter and said something that rearranged the architecture of Dessa's understanding. "You know, it wasn't the bank that took your house." Dessa went still. "Calder Stokes bought your note, paid 40 cents on the dollar for it, 6 months before the foreclosure. He's been doing it up and down the valley, buys the debt cheap, accelerates the timeline, takes the land. Your place was just one of 7 this year." Dessa stood in the store with the bag of salt in her hand and felt something lock into place inside her, a mechanism she had not known existed, turning over with a heavy final click. She was not a victim of circumstance. She was not a casualty of bad luck or bad timing, or the cruel mathematics of poverty. A man had looked at her grief and her debt and her dead husband and had seen opportunity. He had turned her loss into a land deed, her mourning into a transaction, her family's ruin into one more parcel on his surveyor's map. Her home, the home Larkin built with hands that knew wood the way a poet knows language, was a line item in someone else's expansion plan. 40 cents on the dollar. That was the price of a life. That was the exchange rate between a family's home and a rich man's ambition. 40 cents for the door Larkin planed by hand. 40 cents for the porch where Tuck used to sit and watch the evening settle over the valley. 40 cents for the marks on the doorframe where her children's heights were recorded in pencil, each line a measure of time and growth and the ordinary miracle of a family existing in a place. She walked out of the store and stood on the porch, the bag of salt in one hand, the weight of what she had just learned pressing down on her shoulders harder than any load of chimney stones. Nettie was in town that morning. She had walked down to deliver mending work and pick up a spool of thread Dessa had arranged through the hardware store. They were supposed to meet at Orvilla's and walk home together. Dessa was about to go looking for her when she heard someone running. She turned. Nettie was coming up the street, moving faster than Dessa had ever seen her move. She was breathing hard and her eyes were wide and she spoke before she had fully stopped. A man was asking about us at Orvila's store. Tall, gray hair at the sides, fine black horse tied out front. I came back and he was at the counter talking to Orvila. Dessa didn't need a name. She knew the horse. She knew the man. Calder Stokes was no longer a rumor or a suspicion or a 40-cent transaction buried in county records. He was here, in the valley, asking questions about a woman and 2 children living in a cave on land he believed was his. Dessa looked at her daughter. The girl was breathing hard from running, her cheeks flushed, her eyes sharp with the kind of awareness that comes from growing up too fast in a world that does not wait for children to be ready. "Did he see you?" "No, I was at the back of the store. He didn't know I was there." "Good." Dessa took her daughter's hand. She picked up the salt. She walked back up the mountain carrying both, and carrying something else too. Something that had been building inside her since the night Ardith Sperling sat on the flat rock and told her to keep the anger. Something that had sharpened during the blizzard when she knelt on a frozen ledge and cried for 2 minutes and then stopped. Something that had found its name in Larkin's letter and its target in Orvila Tate's quiet words. From that day forward, this was no longer survival. This was refusal. The creek ran beside them as they climbed, the water catching the late afternoon light and breaking it into fragments that scattered across the rocks. The dam was visible from the trail, its curved wall of stone solid and deliberate, holding the water in a pool that reflected the sky. Dessa looked at it as she passed. She had built that dam with her hands and her children's hands, stone by stone, the same way Calder Stokes had built his empire, piece by piece, foreclosure by foreclosure, grief by grief. The difference was that she had built something that fed people, and he had built something that consumed them. The next storm would not come from the sky. Spring came to the mountain the way trust comes to people who have been betrayed, slowly, in small gestures that could still be taken back. A warm afternoon followed by a freezing night, buds appearing on the sourwood branches, then retreating into themselves when frost returned, the creek rising half an inch, then dropping again. Nothing committed, everything provisional. Dessa understood the rhythm because she had been living inside a version of it for 5 months. You build a thing. You wait to see if it holds. You do not celebrate until the holding has lasted long enough to stop being luck and start being structure. By the second week of March, the holding was real. The corn had broken through the soil in uneven rows, pale green shoots that leaned slightly east, chasing morning light. The bean plants had sent out tendrils that groped blindly for support until Nettie pushed sticks into the ground beside them, and the tendrils wrapped on within hours, climbing with a determination that seemed personal. Dessa knelt between the rows each morning, pulling weeds by hand, careful to distinguish the shallow root systems of the invaders from the deeper, stronger roots of what she had planted. She taught Nettie and Tuck to do the same. Gripping low, pulling straight up, shaking the dirt loose before tossing the weed aside. The motion was simple, but the judgment was not. A weed looks like a plant. A plant looks like a weed. The difference is invisible until you learn to see it. And learning to see it requires the kind of patient repetition that cannot be taught in a single afternoon or from a single book. It requires kneeling in the dirt day after day until your fingers know more than your eyes. She extended the planting area. Squash went in along the south edge where the sun hit longest. Peppers in a short row near the cave entrance where reflected heat from the rock wall created a microclimate 2 or 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding ground. She showed the children how to dust the base of each plant with wood ash from the hearth, a barrier against the beetles and grubs that would come when the soil warmed fully. The shelter she built beside the cave wall was simple: 4 posts of greenwood driven into the ground, crossbeams lashed with wire from Harlan Deaver's gift, a roof of layered branches packed with mud that would harden in the sun and shed rain once it cured. It stored firewood and tools and kept them dry. Nettie organized the interior with a precision that bordered on obsession, each item in its place, each place labeled with a mark scratched into the wood. Tuck checked the roof every morning after rain, repositioning branches where the mud had cracked. An inspection routine he had invented himself and that he performed with the seriousness of a foreman walking a job site. He was still 7 years old, But 7 had changed since November. 7 in November was a boy holding a tin can and asking how much farther. 7 in March was a boy who understood that a cracked roof becomes a leaking roof, and a leaking roof becomes a ruined store of firewood, and ruined firewood becomes a cold night, and cold nights are not abstract problems. They are real, and they have consequences, and the consequences begin with a crack in the mud that a careful person catches before the rain does. Nettie walked down the mountain twice a week to learn reading and writing from a retired school teacher in town named Mrs. Prater. The exchange was simple: smoked fish and help weeding Mrs. Prater's garden in return for lessons. Nettie came back each time with pages of practice sums and a focused look that softened only when she read by firelight in the evening, her lips moving silently. Her finger tracing the words the way her father's fingers used to trace the grain of a board he was about to plane. The town stopped using directions to describe the place. Nobody said up past the South Fork or that cave above the bend anymore. They said Dessa's place, or simply the place, and everyone knew. It had become a landmark. Not because it was large or visible or marked on any map, but because it represented something that the people of Banner Creek recognized without naming: the stubbornness of a life that refuses to be extinguished. Pastor Lemuel Fawcett returned on a cool morning in early April. Dessa saw him coming up the trail and felt her body tighten, the memory of their last conversation still fresh. His words about the county judge still carrying weight even after the weeks that had passed. But something was different this time. He carried no Bible. His hands were full. A canvas bag in one, a paper sack in the other. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and waited until Dessa came out to meet him. He did not step forward. He let her set the distance. "I brought clothes for the children," he said. "Some outgrown things from families in the congregation, and a primer. Arithmetic and reading. I thought Nettie might use it." Dessa looked at the bag, then at his face. She was searching for the mechanism behind the gift, the lever that would eventually be pulled, the condition that would eventually be named. She had learned to distrust generosity that arrived without invoice. "I've done a lot of thinking since the last time I was here," Pastor Lemuel said. "I still worry about these kids. I won't pretend I don't. But I've been watching from town, hearing what people say. And I see that you're doing something here that a lot of folks with 4 walls and a mortgage can't manage." He paused. The morning light caught the gray in his hair and the lines around his mouth, and Dessa noticed for the first time that he looked tired, not from the climb, but from something older and less curable. "I'm not going to speak to the judge," he said, "but I need you to hear me when I say that if I ever come up here and those children are hungry or sick or hurt, I will do what I have to do. That's not a threat. That's a promise between 2 people who both want the same thing." Dessa held his gaze. "Fair enough." It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was an agreement between 2 stubborn people who had found the narrow strip of ground where their stubbornness overlapped. Pastor Lemuel set the bags down, nodded once, and turned back down the trail. He didn't look at the cave or the chimney or the dam. He had seen enough. That night, Nettie opened the primer by firelight and turned to the first page. She read for an hour, her lips moving silently, her finger tracing sums and letters. When she looked up, her face held an expression Dessa had not seen in months: uncomplicated pleasure. The simple joy of a child learning something because she wants to, not because survival requires it. Dessa watched her daughter read and felt the distance between what they had lost and what they were building narrow by 1 more degree. Not closing, not healed, but narrowing, the way a wound narrows when you keep it clean and let the body do what the body knows how to do. The rains came hard in May. The creek swelled until it roared, brown water carrying branches and debris downstream at a speed that made the children step back from the bank. Dessa watched the dam from the ledge outside the cave, her eyes tracking the water line as it climbed against the stones she and Nettie and Tuck had placed, the structure absorbing the current's force, flexing but not breaking. Then on the 3rd day of continuous rain, water began seeping around the left side, finding a channel between the dam's edge and the creek bank, widening it with each passing hour. They worked in the rain, all 3 of them, hauling stones and logs to shore up the breach. The water was knee-deep and cold enough to numb their legs within minutes. Dessa lifted the heavy stones into place, her boots slipping on the creek bed, her injured left hand gripping with what strength it had, which was less than it used to be and would never be what it was before the blizzard. Nettie positioned rocks while Tuck filled gaps and packed mud behind the reinforcements, his small hands working with a speed that was part panic and part practice. The breach stabilized, the dam bent but did not break. And then as Dessa turned to reach for another stone, she heard a sound that stopped her heart. A splash followed by silence. Tuck was gone. He had been standing on a flat rock at the dam's edge, reaching for a piece of driftwood caught in the overflow, when his feet went out from under him. The current took him before he could cry out. Dessa saw him surface 5 yards downstream, his head turning, his hands grabbing at water that offered nothing to hold. She was in the creek before she had made a conscious decision to move. Her legs driving through the current, her arms reaching, her vision narrowed to a single point, the back of her son's jacket, dark blue, moving away from her. She caught him at the bend where the creek narrowed between 2 rocks. Her hand closed on his collar. She pulled him against the current, her feet braced against the creek bed, her arms burning with the effort. The water pushed them both toward the rocks. She turned her body so that her back hit the stone instead of his, and the impact sent a bolt of pain through her spine that she registered and dismissed in the same instant, because pain was information. And the only information that mattered was whether she had him. She had him. Nettie was on the bank, lying flat on her stomach, her arms extended over the water. Dessa lifted Tuck. Nettie grabbed his jacket and pulled, and the 3 of them ended up on the bank in a heap of mud and water and gasping breath, the rain still falling, the creek still roaring, the dam still holding. Nobody spoke for a long time. They sat in the rain and held each other and breathed. Tuck's eyes were wide and his body shook with cold, but he was not crying. Something had changed in his face, something subtle but permanent, the way a piece of green wood changes when it has been through fire. It does not look different, but it will never bend the same way again. That night, dry and warm by the fire, Tuck sat apart from the others. He stared at his hands, turning them over, examining the scrapes and the raw skin and the fingernails rimmed with creek mud. Then he said, in a voice Dessa had never heard from him before, quiet and level and certain, "Tomorrow I'm going to fix that slick spot by the dam. I know which stones to use, the flat gray ones from the upper bank. They have more grip when they're wet." Dessa looked at her son. He was 7 years old, and he was sitting by a fire in a cave on a mountain in West Virginia, and he was making a plan to solve a problem that had nearly killed him. And he was making it with the calm practicality of a man who has spent a lifetime working with his hands. Larkin's voice came out of that boy. Not the words, the tone, the quiet assumption that a problem is something you fix, not something you fear. Dessa nodded. "Show me in the morning." It was the first time she had asked either of her children to lead, and Tuck heard the weight of it and sat a little straighter by the fire. June settled in. The corn grew tall, the beans climbed their supports and flowered. Squash runners sprawled along the ground, the broad leaves shading the soil and keeping moisture in. The fish supply was steady. Nettie kept her records, which now included weather observations, water levels, and the number of days since the last rainfall. More than 150 tally marks on the cave wall. Each one a day survived. Each one a line scratched into stone by an 11-year-old girl who had turned 12 somewhere in the counting and who had not mentioned her birthday to anyone because birthdays belong to a world where time is measured in celebrations rather than endurance. Dessa noticed. She traded an extra bundle of smoked fish at Orvila's store for a small tin of honey and a handful of dried apples, and that evening she made a kind of cake in the cast-iron skillet, cornmeal sweetened with honey and studded with apple pieces, and she set it in front of Nettie and said, "Happy birthday." And Nettie looked at the cake and then at her mother, and her face broke open with something that was not a smile and not tears, but both at once. The way a dam breaks when the water behind it has been building for too long. In July, Calder Stokes made his final move. Padden Griggs came up the trail on a Thursday morning. He was alone except for Calder Stokes, who followed 30 yards behind, staying near the tree line as if proximity to the actual eviction might stain him in some way he was not prepared to accept. Beside Stokes walked a younger man carrying a leather ledger and a surveyor's chain, the kind of person whose job was to reduce the world to measurements and legal descriptions. Padden carried a folder. Inside the folder were documents that Stokes's lawyer had prepared: an updated deed, a surveyor's plat, a formal notice of trespass, and a writ from the county court authorizing removal of unauthorized occupants. Every paper was signed, sealed, and dated. The legal machinery was complete. There were no loopholes, no ambiguities, no procedural defects that might buy time. Padden stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at what Dessa had built. He had been here once before, on the worst day of her life, standing on the porch of the house Larkin built, delivering papers he did not want to deliver. Now he was here again carrying a different set of papers toward the same woman, and the symmetry of it sat in his chest like a stone. He looked at the dam. Water flowed through the overflow channel with a sound like quiet conversation. He looked at the chimney, its column of smoke straight and steady. He looked at the garden, the corn now waist-high, the beans heavy with pods, the squash sprawling green and vigorous across dark soil. He looked at the shelter with its mud roof and organized interior. He looked at the cave entrance with its solid door, the wood weathered now but still true in the frame. He looked at Nettie's tally marks on the cave wall, visible from outside. More than 150 vertical lines scratched into stone, each one a day survived. Dessa stood at the cave entrance. Nettie and Tuck were behind her. Harlan Deaver was to her right. He had arrived 10 minutes before Padden, as if he had known, or as if the mountain had told him. Ardith Sperling stood further back near the shelter. A few others from town were scattered at the edges of the clearing. People who had walked up the trail that morning without being asked, drawn by the same current of information that had always moved through Banner Creek. Not at the speed of boredom this time, but at the speed of concern. Stokes stepped out of the tree line. He removed his hat, not from courtesy but from habit, a reflex trained into him by a mother who had taught him manners without managing to teach him mercy. "Mrs. Catlett, I think you know why I'm here." "I know exactly why you're here, Mr. Stokes. This land is mine. I purchased the rights to this entire parcel through a legal process that I did not invent and that I followed to the letter. I have the paperwork. I have the deed. What I don't have is a reason to let a squatter remain on my property." The word squatter landed between them with a weight he intended, and she absorbed. She let it sit there for a moment before she spoke. "You bought my family's debt for 40 cents on the dollar and accelerated the foreclosure so you could take our home. You didn't break any law, but you knew exactly what you were doing to us. And now you're standing on land that was dead when you bought it, looking at a dam I built and a garden I planted and a chimney I laid stone by stone, and you're calling me a squatter." Stokes's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this way, certainly not by someone he considered a debtor, a dependent, a problem to be administered. He had expected resistance, but not precision. He had expected anger, but not clarity. "I don't want to involve law enforcement," he said, "but I will if you leave me no choice." "Then you'll have to look at my children when you do it." She said it without raising her voice. The man with the ledger shifted his weight from one foot to the other and studied the ground. Stokes opened his mouth to respond, but something behind Dessa caught his attention. Movement at the tree line. Harlan Deaver had not moved. He simply stood where he had been standing, his arms at his sides, his face set in the expression of a man who has decided what he is prepared to do and is waiting to see if doing it becomes necessary. But behind him, Ardith Sperling had stepped forward. And behind Ardith, two men from town whose names Dessa did not know, but whose faces she recognized from the hardware store and the feed mill. And behind them, a woman carrying a basket and another man in a canvas coat and a boy of about 16 who stood at the back with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, the way jaws set when you are young and angry and watching something unfair happen to someone who does not deserve it. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to block Stokes's path or to confront him. They simply stood in the clearing. 7 people arranged in a loose semicircle behind Dessa, witnesses to whatever was about to happen. It was not a mob, it was not a protest, it was a community making itself visible, and the visibility itself was the message. Stokes looked at Dessa, then at the people behind her, then at the dam, then at the corn growing in rows that were imperfect, but alive. He looked at the man with the ledger, but the man with the ledger had nothing to offer him. Ledgers do not account for what was happening in this clearing. There is no column for it, no line item, no entry that converts a woman's refusal into a number that can be weighed against a deed. He turned to Padden Griggs. "Serve the papers." Padden opened the folder. He looked at the documents. He looked at the garden. He looked at the dam. Then he did something that no one in the clearing expected, least of all himself. He walked to the garden. He crouched down between two rows of corn. He pressed his hand flat against the soil. The earth was dark and moist and alive with the particular richness that comes from months of careful tending. Ash worked in. Water carried up the hill in punctured cans, weeds pulled by hand, roots protected. Sun and rain and labor combined into something that was no longer raw ground but cultivated land. He closed his fingers around a handful of it and held it for a moment, feeling its weight and texture. Then he let it fall. He stood up. He closed the folder. He turned and looked at Calder Stokes, who was standing at the tree line with his arms crossed, waiting for the thing he had paid his lawyer to make happen. "My report will state that this parcel is under active and productive use," Payton said. His voice was even, measured, pitched to carry across the clearing without rising to a shout. "The eviction order is predicated on the classification of this land as abandoned and unimproved. That classification is no longer accurate." Stokes's face went dark, the color rising from his collar to his jaw to his temples in a slow tide that was not embarrassment but something colder and more dangerous. "You don't have the authority to overrule a county writ. I have the authority to assess conditions on the ground and file a report based on what I observe. What I observe is cultivated land, a functional water management structure, a permanent shelter with a working hearth, and 3 residents who have transformed an unused parcel into a productive homestead. My report will reflect that. The court can decide what to do with it. I'll have your job for this. You might, but my report will still say what it says." Padden turned to Dessa. He did not smile. He did not offer reassurance or congratulations or any of the soft words that people use to cushion the moments when the world shifts. He looked at her the way one working person looks at another when the work speaks for itself. He nodded. Then he walked down the trail, past Calder Stokes, who stood rigid at the tree line, his face the color of old brick, his hands at his sides, his expensive hat casting a shadow across eyes that could not quite believe what had just happened. Stokes did not leave immediately. He stood for a full minute, looking at the clearing, the cave, the garden, the people. He was calculating. Dessa could see it, the same calculation he had made when he bought her debt, the same arithmetic of cost and benefit and acceptable loss that had driven every acquisition, every foreclosure, every family pushed off their land so that his acreage could grow by one more piece. But this calculation was different because the variables had changed. The woman he had displaced was still here. The land he had purchased was no longer empty. The community he had ignored was no longer invisible. And the deputy he had expected to be his instrument had become something else entirely. Stokes walked to his wagon and took something from the back, a metal sign, white with red letters, private property, no trespassing. He drove the post into the ground near the dam with 3 strikes of a mallet, the sound sharp and final in the morning quiet. "I'll be back," he said, "with the law." He climbed onto the wagon. The younger man with the ledger climbed up beside him. They drove away. The sound of hooves and axles faded down the logging road, and the mountain reclaimed its silence. Dessa did not pull the sign up. She left it standing in the dirt, a marker of the border between what Stokes believed he owned and what she knew she had built. Borders work both ways. A sign that says "keep out" also says something is here worth keeping out of. Harlan Deaver walked over and stood beside her looking at the sign. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he said, "Your squash needs staking before the runners get too long. I've I've got some old tobacco stakes at my place. I'll bring them tomorrow. It was the most ordinary sentence a man could say, and it was exactly right. After the drama and the threats and the creak of Calder Stokes's wagon fading down the trail, Harlan Deaver talked about squash. Because squash was real and needed tending and would feed 3 people in August if it was staked properly, and that mattered more than signs and deeds and men in expensive hats. Dessa's legs trembled. The shaking she had held back during the entire confrontation released at once, running through her thighs and calves and into her feet. And she sat down on the ledge outside the cave and pressed her hands against the stone and let it pass. The first ears of corn came in late July. Nettie roasted them on the cast-iron skillet, turning them with a stick until the kernels were golden, and the smell filled the cave with something so close to the smell of a real kitchen that Dessa had to close her eyes for a moment and let the memory wash over her without drowning in it. Tuck burned his fingers on the first ear and learned in 2 seconds what a full day of instruction could not have taught him. They ate until they were full. None of them could remember the last time that had happened. Ardith Sperling came one final time in August carrying a cloth bag of seeds. Amaranth, medicinal herbs for next year, she said. Dessa took them and felt the weight of those 2 words. Next year. She was no longer thinking about surviving the winter. She was thinking about seasons, cycles, years, the planning horizon of someone who intends to stay. September brought cooler air and the first hints of gold in the maple leaves along the creek. Dessa placed a candle beside Larkin's letter on a flat stone near the back of the cave. She did not speak. She did not pray. She sat in the quiet and let the flames say what words could not. That the life she had built in this place was not a replacement for the life she had lost, but a continuation of it. Built with the skills Larkin taught her, and the strength he believed she had, and the anger Ardith told her to keep, and the stubbornness Harlan respected, and the records Nettie kept, and the firewood Tuck stacked, and the fish they caught, and the seeds they planted, and the stones they carried, one by one, up the hill. The wind turned cold. They prepared. Firewood inspected, the chimney reinforced, the door strengthened with strips of steel wire. The routine was no longer desperate, it was deliberate. The difference between fighting for survival and caring for a home is not in the tasks themselves, but in the spirit behind them. The tasks were the same. The spirit had changed. Mid-morning on a clear day in late September, the sound of footsteps on the trail. Harlan Deaver appeared at the clearing's edge, and behind him, 4 men and 2 women from town carrying tools and lumber and something wrapped in burlap. Harlan walked to Dessa and stood beside her, looking out over the valley. The creek caught the morning sun and threw it back in fragments. The corn, dry now and ready for harvest, rustled in a breeze that carried the smell of autumn. "It's not official," Harlan said. "No government stamp, no surveyor's mark, but we figured it was time." One of the men unwrapped the burlap. Inside was a metal sign, hand-lettered in black paint on a white background, the edges slightly uneven, the letters slightly imperfect, made by someone who cared more about meaning than presentation. Refuge by the creek. They mounted it on a flat rock near the entrance to the clearing, securing it with bolts driven into holes drilled with a hand brace. It took 15 minutes. Nobody made a speech. Nobody explained what the sign meant or why they had made it. The meaning was self-evident to every person present, and self-evident things do not require explanation. Dessa looked at the sign. 2 signs now stood at the borders of her clearing. One white with red letters, planted by a man who believed he owned the land. One white with black letters, planted by people who knew what the land had become. The 2 signs faced each other across 50 yards of cultivated ground, like arguments made in different languages about the same piece of earth. That evening they cooked together, Dessa and Nettie and Tuck and Harlan and Ardith and the others from town who had carried the sign up the mountain. The fire burned high and the cave was crowded and warm and filled with voices for the first time since Dessa had arrived with nothing but a skillet and a letter and 2 children, and the refusal to disappear. After the others left, after the fire had burned down to coals that pulsed orange in the darkness, after Tuck had fallen asleep with his head on a rolled quilt and his tin can beside him, Dessa sat with Nettie at the cave entrance. The night was clear. Stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon, more than could be counted, each one a small, persistent light in an enormous darkness. The creek murmured below, steady and patient, the same sound it had made when Larkin was alive, and the same sound it would make long after everyone who remembered him was gone. Dessa flexed her left hand in the darkness. The fingers closed most of the way, but not all the way. They would never close all the way again. The knuckles ached when the temperature dropped below freezing, a deep, persistent throb that lived in the bone and that she had stopped mentioning because mentioning it changed nothing, and silence was lighter to carry than complaint. Her right shoulder caught when she raised her arm above her head, a sharp click followed by a slow burn that reminded her, every time, of the rock ledge in the blizzard, of the hatchet swung one-handed in the dark, of the 2 minutes she spent on her knees in the wind, crying, before she stopped and climbed down and went back inside to her children. The injuries were permanent. The price of the life she had built, written into her body in a language of stiffness and ache and limitation that would be with her for the rest of her days. She did not resent them. The scars on her hands and the damage in her shoulder and the fingers that would not fully close were receipts. Proof of purchase. Evidence that what she had was not given to her but earned, and that the earning had cost something real, and that the cost was acceptable because the alternative was a cot in a room that belonged to someone else, and the quiet charity of people who meant well, but who would never understand what it costs to rebuild a life from nothing, and the slow erasure of a woman named Dessa Catlett, who had once lived in a house built by a man whose hands understood wood the way a preacher's hands understand scripture. She thought about that house. She could see it in her mind. The porch. The door Larkin planed by hand, the marks on the doorframe. She could see the key on the railing next to the eviction papers. She could see the road climbing away from it toward the ridge. She did not want to go back. The realization arrived without fanfare, no dramatic shift, no revelation accompanied by swelling music or a change in the light, just a quiet understanding that settled into her the way warmth settles into stone. The house was the past. It was Larkin's masterpiece and her happiest years, and the place where her children took their first steps and said their first words, and it was gone. Not taken. Gone. The way all things built by human hands eventually go, returned to the ground. Absorbed by time, remembered but not retrievable. What she had now was different, rougher, harder, built not with a craftsman's patience but with a survivor's urgency. The walls were uneven. The door was salvaged planks, not planed lumber. The floor was stone, not wood. The ceiling was rock, not rafters. But it was hers, built by her hands, defended by her voice, sustained by her children, recognized by her neighbors. And no one, not Calder Stokes, not the county court, not the machinery of law and money and power that had taken the first home, could purchase this one at 40 cents on the dollar. Because this home was not a deed or a parcel or a line item. It was a refusal, and refusals cannot be foreclosed. "Mama," Nettie said. Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. The voice she used when she had been considering something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. "The first night we came here, did you think it would turn out like this?" Dessa considered the question. She owed her daughter an honest answer. She always had. "No," she said. "I only thought about getting through that first night." Nettie nodded. She was looking at the sky, but her eyes had the inward focus of someone reviewing a long sequence of events and finding for the first time that the sequence makes a shape. "I'm glad you didn't stop at the first night," Nettie said. Dessa put her arm around her daughter. Nettie leaned into her, and for a moment they were just two people sitting at the mouth of a cave on a mountain in West Virginia, watching stars and listening to a creek that would flow long after both of them were gone. Inside the cave, the coals glowed. Tuck slept with his tin can beside him, the same tin can he had carried up the mountain on the first day, holding a wooden horse and 5 smooth stones and a feather and a button from his father's shirt. He was still 7. He would turn 8 in November, and the mountain would mark the occasion the way mountains mark everything, with weather and silence and the slow, patient turning of the season. The corn whispered in the night breeze, dry stalks brushing against each other with a sound like paper, like pages turning, like the letter Dessa no longer needed to read because its words had become part of her, the way the calluses on her hands had become part of her. Not added on, grown in, changed by use into something that would not wear away. The door held, built from salvaged planks and hung on traded hinges and reinforced with wire and weathered by 8 months of rain and wind and sun until it was no longer new but seasoned. The kind of door Larkin would have respected, not for its beauty but for its honesty. A door that did exactly what a door is supposed to do. It stood between what was inside and what was outside, and it didn't fail. And the refuge remained. Not because it was permanent. Nothing built by human hands is permanent. The dam would need mending after every hard rain. The chimney would need clearing before every winter. The garden would need planting every spring. The door would need replacing when the wood finally gave out, and the roof would need patching, and the wall would need chinked, and the fire would need feeding, night after night after night, for as long as anyone lived here to feed it. The refuge remained because Dessa Catlett remained, because she had walked up a mountain with 2 children and a cast-iron skillet and a dead man's letter, and she had refused to stop walking, refused to stop building, refused to stop carrying stones up a hill that did not care whether she lived or died, refused to accept the terms that men with money and power and clean hands had written for her life. She remained because Larkin had told her she was strong, because Ardith had told her to keep the anger, because Harlan had called her stubborn and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give, because Nettie kept count, because Tuck kept the fire, because a young deputy named Padden Griggs had knelt in the dirt between 2 rows of corn and closed his hand around a fistful of earth and decided that what he held was more real than what was written in the folder he carried. The stars turned overhead, the creek ran. The wind moved through the trees with the sound it had always made, which is the sound of time passing through a place that will outlast everyone who hears it. Dessa closed her eyes. Her left hand rested in her lap, the fingers curled as far as they would go, which was not all the way, and never would be. Her right shoulder ached with the familiar low burn that meant the weather was changing. Her back held the memory of the rock in the creek where she had turned her body to shield her son. She was tired. She was sore. She was 33 years old, and she looked older and she felt older, and the distance between what she had been and what she had become was measured not in years but in stones carried and fish smoked and fires kept and storms survived and a 2-minute cry on a frozen ledge that she had allowed herself, and then ended because there was work to do. She opened her eyes. The stars were still there. The creek was still there. The door was still there. Her children were still there. She was still there. And tomorrow there would be work.